opportunity to be here, but it's great to be with you tonight. I appreciate you for having me over. Been looking forward to coming. And I was looking forward to seeing Ron, too. I don't get to see Ron too often. And maybe I should just send a video over. I don't know. But anyway, it's great to see him again, even though we talked yesterday by email. And he was telling me that he wasn't going to be able to be here tonight, and I understand his circumstances. But, of course, his brother, twin brother, Don, I'm sure you know, is over in our area. And so I see him quite often, and it's always good to be with them. And Beth Ann Ruffner, I remember little Beth Ann. She was that little girl, as we talked about, up in Bismarck, Illinois. I haven't seen her since she was a little girl, but I remember her well, and what a brat. No, I'm teasing. That's not true. Not true. She was a sweet little girl. Beth Ann, as everybody called her then. I don't know how it goes now. But anyway, her granddaddy, Charlie Hopkins, was an elder in the church there where we preached. And, of course, that was my first time, full-time pulpit work, and so much I didn't know. A lot I don't know now, but I didn't know anything then. And Charlie and Betty were so encouraging to me, and so they've been special to us for a long time. And when she got on the phone back when we set this up, it just thrilled me to know that she was a part of the church here and to hear from that family again. Okay, I assumed that was her. But like I say, she was a little girl last time I saw her. But anyway, just as pretty as she was then. It's good to have my wife Judy here, and also our friend Bobby Jenkins came over with us tonight. Actually, I guess we came over with him. He did the driving tonight, but Bobby's a great friend, and so we're glad that he came with us tonight too. It is so good that we can be here tonight and talk about some important things. Ron has already mentioned in the introduction that tonight we're talking about servanthood, and I know tonight we're talking about being a servant like Paul. But it's interesting that as I looked at your series, that everything has been about servanthood, which is always in season. It's great to think about servanthood and what it can do. Because when we serve the way that we should as Christians, those are the actions that make the deepest impressions on others, and those that we tend to remember. My wife speaks at a lot of ladies' days, and one of the things that she usually brings up, a little illustration that impressed her so that she has never forgotten through the years. We have 3 kids, as was mentioned in the introduction. They're all grown and gone, and with kids of their own at this point. But like all kids, they were small at one point. And when we moved to Gastonia, North Carolina, Phil at this time was 5, and Garrett was 2, about to turn 3, and Micah was just a few weeks old, our daughter. And there was a lady in the congregation there that came to Judy and said, "Hon, you look tired. And I tell you what I'm going to do." She didn't say, "Could I do this?" She said, "Here's what I'm going to do." She said, "Tomorrow's Saturday. I'm going to come over and pick up your 3 kids tomorrow. I'm going to take them away." And we didn't have cell phones then, but we did have the landline, and said, "I want you to turn off the ringer on the phone. I don't want you to answer the door." But she said, "I'm going to keep your kids all day long for you, and I want you to rest." Now, she was a fine lady. She now worships down at River Chase in Birmingham, and we haven't seen her in quite a long time, but we certainly have not forgotten her for a lot of reasons, and this was one of them. And Judy says that during that time, that is one of the things of service that she did, that she remembers so well that she did, and something that she will never forget. But maybe something that will make you appreciate her a little more, that is Linda, who took our kids, is that she also had 4 kids of her own. So all day long on Saturday, but yet it was an act of service that made an indelible mark that Judy nor I will ever forget. Some of you probably, like me in time past, maybe especially you read a lot of those articles in Reader's Digest. There was one that I remember from years gone by. It was entitled, I come to shine your shoes. Anybody remember that by chance? It's a long time ago, but it's an excellent article. But this lady talked about living in a certain location. They had small kids too, and they received a phone call from back home, which was not nearby, and there had been a death in the family. And she said all of a sudden our world was just upside down, and we're trying to get all the loose ends tied up and letting work know and school know and all the things that had to be done. And she said the doorbell rang. And she went, and there was a guy standing there with the little box in his hand. He said, "Hi, I'm Bill from down the street. I'm your neighbor. I heard that you had someone in your family pass away. And I just want you to know, first of all, very sorry to hear that. But he said, I remember that something similar like that happened to us some years ago. And one of the things that I remember is that our kids all had shoes that had scuffed up toes and such like that would not have been appropriate with what they were going to wear to a funeral. And I remember what a difficult thing it was to try to get all that taken care of. And he said, I am thinking that maybe the same might be true with you. So he said, I came to shine your shoes. So she invites him in, sure enough, and this seemed like a rather odd thing, but she said he sat down in the middle of her kitchen floor, and he took every pair of the kids' shoes and even the adult shoes, and he sat there, and the little box had all kinds of shoe polish and the like in it, and polished every one of those shoes, and she said they looked like they were all brand new. She said of all the nice things that were done during that time, that probably was the act that I remember the most, and she went on to write that article that appeared then in Reader's Digest. Tonight we're talking about Paul as being a servant that we should imitate. In fact, Paul said, I want you to imitate me. 1 Corinthians 11 verse 1, imitate me as I also imitate Christ. So he wasn't saying be like me because I'm me. He was saying, be like me in that I follow Christ, and the kind of example I try to set for others in my servanthood and everything that I do would be in the mode of Jesus and what he left behind as an example for us. There's an interesting statement that is made in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 19. Paul says, although I'm free from all men, I make myself a servant to all. So he has certainly had that servant mindset. And as we think about Paul tonight and the great servant that he was, what I want us to do is follow a very little simple outline that I've got, 3 points actually. And I want us to think about 3 things that made Paul such a valuable servant in the Lord's church, and making some practical applications as we go along too. Number 1, I believe that one of the reasons that Paul was such a valiant servant for the Lord is the view that he had of himself. There are 5 times that he particularly spoke of himself as being a bondservant of Jesus Christ. Not just a servant, but a bondservant of Jesus Christ. As far as we think about it in the Bible, it begins in Romans chapter 1 and verse 1 when it says, Paul, a bondservant of Jesus Christ. That's the way it starts. So he viewed himself right up front and saying that I am a servant. I know in serving God and following after Jesus and in his footsteps that the thing that I am is a bondservant of his, and whatever he says, that's what I want to do. And if he tells me not to do something, I'm not going to do it because he is the master of my life. I'm just his servant, and I'm following him the best way that I know how. Have you ever thought about the things, though, that Paul had to give up when he became a follower of Jesus? I mean, he was moving up the ranks in Judaism as far as the Pharisees, and they had so much control and power in the day. And Paul was well on his way in that political structure. And even though he was all under the guise of following God and persecuting Christianity, he felt like he was doing the right thing, but there were a lot of folks that were saying, whoo, you're going to be something. And he was. He was a gifted man in so many ways. But yet when he became a Christian, how that turned around. He spoke of that in different places, in different ways, but one of the places that comes to my mind is Philippians chapter 3. There we learn that there were some folks that were criticizing him for some of the things that he had done, and often that was the case. But he said if they want to talk about their background, if they want to talk about their importance in the flesh, he said, I can tell you I've got far more confidence in mine. And he said, here's why. I was circumcised on the 8th day of the stock of Israel, and I was of the tribe of Benjamin. He said, I was a Hebrew of Hebrews. He said, as far as the law was concerned, he said, I was one that just kept it. He was one that really hung in there with it, and nobody could criticize him. He said, I was a Pharisee, and everybody knew the Pharisees were those that knew the law. Of course, they had tradition in there too, but he said, I was a Pharisee. And he said, as far as zeal, I persecuted the church. But as far as righteousness that was in the law, he said, I was blameless. But then verse 7, he really gives kind of the key to the whole thing. When he said, all the things that were gained to me before, I count as loss for what I achieved or gained in Christ Jesus. So he gave up what we might think about some good things for something that was better, and he knew that. So the things that he knew before and the things that were important to him and the ranks of which he was climbing, those things were very important at one point. But when he started following Jesus, those things were no longer significant to him. And he then put his treasure in the master of all masters, and he became a servant of his, and he said, whatever he wants me to do, that I will do. But here's something that you and I need to keep in mind about that. It took someone that took on a lot of humility to get from that point to this point, which really was actually that point. In other words, he was very humble, and he gave up those things, and he was criticized for it and put down for it. But he said, that doesn't matter to me, because what matters to me most is that I'm pleasing to my master, and my master is Jesus Christ. So when we think about that kind of servanthood, we think about someone who, first of all, had to empty himself before he was really any good to himself or to God either in the long run. Let me just go back and bring out another character that we read about in the Bible. His name was Moses. You all know Moses quite well. And remember that he grew up in Pharaoh's house, and he was skilled. Acts chapter 7 gives us a lot of good information about how he was raised and all the great wisdom of the Egyptians and all the advantages that he had. And you know that the story of Moses is broken into 40-year increments. And of course, when he's 40 years old, he thinks at that time that God is going to use him to go out and deliver his people, the Israelites, from their bondage. But God wasn't ready for that yet. And we learned that even though he had all this power and all this schooling, he went out and killed the Egyptian, then of course there was the striving the next day that kind of got him in trouble. But when he killed the Egyptian, he knew that he was in trouble because it didn't work out the way that he thought. So for the next 40 years, he's off in the wilderness. He becomes a shepherd. And then when he's 80 years old, God says, now I'm ready to use you. You see, those things he learned in early life, they were important. But maybe it made him feel a little more important about himself than he really was. And so he had to empty himself before really he could become a servant for the Lord and do what God wanted him to do. And I think that you and I can learn a lot from that. And that is, yes, it's a wonderful thing to have an education. It's a wonderful thing to be knowledgeable about the things that go on in the world and to read, and I would encourage that of anyone. But sometimes when it comes to spiritual things, and I think pretty much 100% of the time, the way that we become the best servants is when we empty ourselves of those things and just say, Lord, I'm a blank slate. You tell me what you want me to be, and that's what I will be. And that's the way that Paul viewed himself, and that's one of the reasons why he was such a great servant. It's because he viewed himself certainly just as a bond servant and not somebody that was important. But he also had a great appreciation for what God had done for him. To think about another passage where he spoke of himself, he said, let me tell you what I was like before. And remember in 1 Timothy chapter 1, beginning about verse 14, he said, now before, he said, let me tell you the kind of person I was. I was a persecutor. I was an insolent man. I was one that was doing all these things, but he talked about how the mercy and grace of God was kind upon him. And then he goes on to say in verse 15, he said, this is a faithful saying and worthy of all acceptance, that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, and I'm the chief. He always thought of himself, he said, if you want to look at somebody who's done some sinning in his life, he said, you look at mine. And he thought about how he persecuted the church, and he thought about him being a blasphemer, and he thought about him being that insolent man. He was arrogant. But he said, not anymore. In 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 10, he said, I am what I am by the grace of God. I think about him when he would go out, and so often he was confronted by these Judaizing teachers and all these false teachers and the like. And you'd think after a while he'd get so tired of that, and I'm sure he'd get wearied with that from time to time. But what kept him going? What kept him going to be the kind of person, the servant that he was, and just keep on keeping on the way that he did? I think what he really saw was this. You've heard the expression before, but I'm going to use it here because I think it applies to his life. When he would say, but for the grace of God, go I. When he saw these Judaizing teachers and how zealous they were for the old law and such like, he said, I used to be just like them. And had it not been for Christ and what he did for me, I would still be just like them. And he said, I know I'd be lost. But he has such a great appreciation of knowing that God had been so merciful and kind to him. But could we all say the same thing? We might not have been to the stature that Paul was in life. But when we see others that are non-Christian, but for the grace of God go I. I could be that. That might be me. I could very well have been that if I made some different decisions in my life. If I hadn't had the influence that I had of certain people, maybe my parents or maybe somebody else. But for the grace of God go I. So that's number one. Paul was a tremendous servant of the Lord because of the way he viewed himself. But then moving on to a little more practical application of how we are to serve the Lord. Number two, he was such a tremendous servant of the Lord because of the way he viewed others. In Philippians chapter 2, remember he's writing by inspiration, but I'm sure he lived it this way. When he said, let not every man think on his own things or on his own interests, but also on the interests of others. In other words, put others above yourself, and I believe Paul did that in his own life. And there are a lot of great scriptures that talk about this, but in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 15, he said, I am more than ready to spend and be spent for your souls. Paul was willing to lay it on the line. He said, there's not anything that I don't want to do for somebody else in winning them to the Lord. He had such a passion. And I wish, and I pray every day that I would develop my passion more for other people. And by that, I don't mean just people in general. I'm talking about their souls. You see, I've got neighbors that don't go to church. I pass by folks that are mowing their grass every Sunday morning or working out in their yard doing something. And we live right beside, or we don't live, but we have the church building right beside a road that goes right down to a boat ramp, which is one of the major ones on the Tennessee River. And every Sunday morning when I get out of my vehicle, there are all these trucks and they're pulling their boats and such like. And I'd like to think, well, they went to an early morning service, but I doubt it. But what I really think about is whether or not I'm concerned about their souls. Paul had such a passion. In Romans 10 and verse 1, brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they might be saved. And the one that always haunts me when I think about the passion that he had is actually recorded in chapter 9 of Romans in verse 3. When he said, I wish or I would be accursed from God if it meant the salvation of my brethren. I don't think I've ever said that. If I did, I didn't say it honestly. And I don't say that to my credit. I'm just saying I want to have that kind of passion. It's hard for me to say that I'd be lost if it meant the salvation. No, I don't think I want to be lost in any respect. But if I can have that kind of passion for people to try to win them to the Lord. Let's think about that for a minute. What is our number one responsibility as a church? To seek and save the lost, isn't it? That's it. I mean, yes, we come together to worship and we keep the saved, and we help the needy and such, all those things. But really, if you're thinking about one major heading of what we are as a church, we're to go about the business of the Lord. Luke 19 and verse 10 came to seek and save that which was lost. I know we live in a tough time. I'm there. I live it every day. But have you ever considered how well we do at winning the lost to the Lord? Do you know how many people are baptized on average in any given Church of Christ? If you were to put them all together and average them out, here it is. Here's the statistics, and I think they still hold true, although it came out just a few years ago. It says in the average Church of Christ, if we just divide ourselves equally across the board, here's the way it would come out. The average Church of Christ, even though we say that our number one thing is to seek and save the lost, we baptize 8 people a year. That's it. 8 people a year. But that's not the end of the story. We learned that 6 of those are our own children. Now, that's not a bad thing. It's a great thing. We need to have a mission field with our own kids. That's not a negative thing. It's just to say, of those we're baptizing, 6 of those happen to be our own children. So that means in the average Church of Christ, we bring 2 people out of the world, so to speak, into our congregation in a given year, but that's not the end of it either. What we have learned is that one of those 2 is going to turn back into the world within a year's time. So the average congregation of the Church of Christ brings 1 person in from the world on any given year. That bothers me. And I'm pointing the finger at me. I'm not saying it's your fault. I'm saying I'm just as much at fault as anyone. And there again, I know there are a lot of folks that are not interested in spiritual things in our day, and it's sad. In fact, the truth is the church as a whole is shrinking. And I don't say that to be a prophet of doom. I'm just being factual. But if our number one reason for existence is to seek and save the lost, that should challenge us. And I believe that Paul felt that. His servanthood gave him the passion to say, I'm going to reach out and I'm going to do as much as I can. But here's a way that you and I may be wild to think about this. How often do we invite somebody even to come to church? Do we think about that? Have you invited somebody to church this week? Did you invite somebody last week? I'm not talking about just setting up a Bible. I'm talking about just inviting them to come to church. You see, so often it's easy to get about our own things and forget about how we are to serve others. And what greater service can we do for anyone on the face of this earth than do our best to lead them to the Lord? Paul not only served in that way, but we learned that everybody was on an equal plane with him. Paul was just as kind and gracious to Onesimus the slave, the runaway slave, as we know him in the book of Philemon, as he was to those dignitaries of Rome that he stood before. He saw them all on an equal plane. And he was just as concerned about the soul of Onesimus as he was Nero. He was concerned about everyone equally, and he served them all the same. And I think you and I need to do the same thing. We need to serve everyone equally. There's no one, as the saying goes, that stands any higher at the foot of the cross. It's level there. Everybody stands on equal plane when we stand before the cross of Jesus. But I'm going to tell a story that Beth will not remember that happened in Illinois many years ago. She was too young to remember. That's why I know that she doesn't remember. But I'm going to tell you something that's haunted me through the years. And I tell this story every once in a while in different places. And it always hurts me a little bit, but I think I need to be reminded of it too. You know, we can screen folks out if we want to. If someone comes into our service and maybe they don't look the way that we think we ought to look or something about them, we can screen them out. We don't have to say a thing. In fact, that's the way we do it. We can say nothing and they won't come back. If we don't serve them and show them the love of Christ, they're probably not going to come back. In the little congregation there in Bismarck, we were very good. The church was very good. When we would have a visitor from the community, they would come in. Oh boy, we made sure that we're on the phone and we'd go by, or we'd send them notes or something, which I think is a marvelous thing to this day to do, to let someone know that they're welcome. And you know, the church was, I give them a lot of credit, and they're very good about that. But there was, in a small town like Bismarck, everybody knows everybody. So there was a lady that I had never met before, but I had heard of her. And I'll just be kind of plain spoken here. Everybody knew her in town. She was not a member of the church. She was in town, though. And everybody just knew her as the lady of the evening of the town. Okay, so that's, everybody knows where we're going with this. One Sunday morning, Judy and I were sitting almost where Judy is sitting there now. And they had the theater seats at that time, an old building. And I could almost hear the chins hitting the floor. Before I knew, well, I heard somebody come in, but I didn't think much about it. It was at the beginning of a service. And sure enough, there was this lady that came in. Now, she was not immodestly dressed. She was very well dressed that day. She was dressed like she's coming to church. Not only that, she brought her Bible with her. And she had an 18-year-old daughter at that time. And from what people had said, she was following right along in her mother's footsteps. They came in, and they sat down right there. And, you know, everybody kind of aghast and thinking, wow, and never expected her to show up, you know, kind of one of those things. And I remember so well that I could kind of see them from where we were. They'd announced a song number. You could tell they had no idea about the songs we were singing, never heard them before, and they couldn't sing them because they were trying the best they could. When I got in the pulpit that day, they were a delight for a teacher because every time I'd call out a scripture, they didn't know where to look, but they were trying their best to find it in their Bibles, and they were writing down notes on the paper, and boy, they were tuned in. I mean, if you had somebody that you'd say, I believe they were listening that day, it would have been those two. But here's the thing. I remember meeting them when they went out that day, and I spoke to them. They introduced themselves as I did to them, myself to them, and they left, and that was it. I won't say that it didn't happen, but I know I didn't. I didn't try to go by and see them. I didn't call them. I didn't send them a note. And from what I heard in conversation from others, they didn't either. We didn't serve those people. We were selective in those that we were serving. That's not the end of that story either. About a month later, I learned that they had gone to Danville, which was 10 miles south of us, and they had joined a charismatic church there and became very actively involved in that situation. And that haunts me to this day because I thought, and I still think, and I crucify myself as much as anyone else, in saying if we had served them the way that we tried to serve everyone else that was a little more normal, they might be members of the Lord's church today. I don't believe Paul was selective in his servanthood. I think the way he viewed others, he always was a servant people. He always wanted to do what was in their best interest. And he did put their interest even above his own. He tried his best to serve them and do what we all should do when we serve others. So he tried in every way that he could to win others to Christ, and he tried to serve them as people the best that he knew how. One other passage that comes to my mind before we go on to point number 3 is when Paul was standing before Agrippa. And he's not pleading to turn me loose because I haven't done anything wrong, but he takes that opportunity to tell him about Jesus. And you remember that expression that is used in King James, you almost persuade me to become a Christian? And the next verse we don't talk about too much, but Paul said, not only you, but everyone that hears my voice right now. I would that almost and altogether that they would be as I am, except for these chains that he is having to endure at the time. He was a tremendous servant because of how he viewed himself. And number 2, he was a tremendous servant because of how he viewed others. He saw everyone as someone that Jesus died for. I always like to say it this way, that everyone in this room is just as important to the Lord as anyone else that's ever lived on the face of this earth or living here now. Jesus died for you just as much as he died for anyone else. That was the servanthood of Jesus. But it also was the attitude that Paul took on in his own life when he went out and he served others. Then the third thing tonight, we learned that Paul was a tremendous servant because of the way he viewed Jesus. Jesus was always number 1 and foremost. There was never any doubt when you read in Paul's life about who came first with him. It was always Jesus. Again, that passage a while ago, I'm willing to spend and be spent for your souls, but really it was all under the umbrella of serving Jesus Christ. There's an interesting statement that is made. You know the statement because you've heard it many times before, that is used in Philippians chapter 1. When Paul said, for me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. Let's use the first part of that statement. For me to live is what? If we really were honest and sincere, I would hope that each one of us in a Wednesday night crowd, I think we'd probably come near finding this, I'd hope that every one of us could say in all honesty tonight, for me to live is Christ. That's number one in my life. I've got other interests in life, but that's number one. Everything else is secondary. I pray that just through in my own heart as well. But can we really say that? I've known some folks that couldn't. I've known them well enough to say if they really said, for me to live is, Christ would not be number one. But that's the only place He can be. And our lives be right with Him. For me to live is Christ, but to die, oh, that's just gain. It just gets better from here on. When you and I consider that, we need to think about that and how it applies to our lives. In Galatians chapter 2 and verse 20, Paul said, I've been crucified with Christ. And it's no longer I who live, but Christ that lives in me. And the life that I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God who loved me and gave Himself for me. The way he viewed Jesus, he said, I've been crucified with Him, and all my passions and everything about me, it's all about Jesus in my life. A.W. Tozer said, when someone makes the commitment to be crucified with Christ, and remember Jesus said, if you're going to follow after me, you're going to have to take up your cross and follow my footsteps. So when we think about that, Tozer said there are three things that all of us share in common when we crucify ourselves with Jesus. Number one, he said we all face in the same direction. I mean, we all have the same purpose, the same goal in life. We're all facing the same direction. Number two, there's no turning back. Once you take up your cross to follow Jesus, there's no getting off the road. Oh, you could fall back. I don't mean that we're, saved and never lose. I'm not talking about that at all. I'm just saying that when we follow Jesus, it's a lifetime commitment. And number three, not only that, but we learn that it's always about Him. We're always on the same track. We're always with Jesus, and we're always following after Him too. And I think that's the way that Paul always saw himself, as one that always saying that Jesus is going to lead my life. But isn't it a wonderful thing, the kind of confidence that he had in his salvation? I don't know about you, but I hope that you're confident in how you stand with the Lord. You see, I didn't grow up that way. I didn't. Even though I grew up in the church, good people, good teachers, godly people, but they probably just went by what they were taught to. But nobody ever really felt good about their salvation. I believe that Paul was very confident about his, but it had nothing to do with the fact that he was an apostle. It had everything to do with the fact that he had given his life to the Lord and he believed what the Lord taught. When I was growing up, here's the way I was taught. Don't ever tell anybody that you're saved because you don't know. You think you are and you hope you are, but it's kind of self-righteous to say that you're saved. And so I got scared. I thought, well, I don't want to do the wrong thing. So if you'd asked me some years ago, what about you, Stan? Are you saved? I'd say, well, hope so. Think so. Why? Because that's the way I was taught. But then when I got old enough and mature enough to start studying the Bible on my own, I thought, I can't really square what I've been taught with what the Bible teaches. 1 John 5, verse 13, John says, these things have I written unto you that you may know, K-N-O-W, that you may know that you have eternal life. And I thought, I didn't think I could know, but it said I could. And there are many other passages. In fact, 1 John is full of the know words. And it took me a while to work through it. But if you were to ask me today, Stan, are you saved? Are you going to go to heaven? I would confidently say, yes, I am. But it has nothing to do with how good I am. I have to follow Jesus like everyone else, but I'm not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. But we can know because the Bible tells us so. But listen to this. Paul said, for me to live is Christ, and because I'm walking in the light, because I'm living for Him, then he says, to die is gain for me, and I know it. But you remember that Paul didn't have a golden ticket because he was an apostle. In fact, in 1 Corinthians 9, verse 27, he said, I buffet, I discipline my body and keep it under subjection, lest when I preach to others, I myself become a castaway or disqualified. So he knew that he had to live a disciplined life. He had to live for the Lord, and he had a choice that he had to live for Him. But then when he got to the end of his life, 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 7, I've fought a good fight. I've finished the course. I have kept the faith. Henceforth, there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give me on that day. You see, he's not saying, I sure hope I make it. He's saying, the Lord's going to give me that crown because he's promised it to me. And he didn't say he promised me because I'm perfect, because Paul wasn't perfect either. But he had surrendered his life to Jesus and become a servant of his. And then he went on to say this, and you and I need to hear the rest of that verse. But not to me only, but to all, that is the crown of righteousness coming, but to all those that have loved his appearing. Isn't that a marvelous passage? But you see, it takes a servant, the one that says, I'm no longer mine, but now I belong to Jesus. I pray tonight, as we've talked here the last few minutes, that it's helped us just in a simple way to think about the importance of servanthood. And Paul says, I want you to imitate me, but not because you want to be like Paul, but he said, because I imitate Christ. And what was Christ? Servant. The one that washed feet. The one that went about doing good. We know about that. And that's the same with you and me. I pray that we will take on our servanthood roles and realize how important we can be to the Lord's service when we're serving him, but also the great reward that awaits us at the end. Like Paul and like you, I someday long to hear, well done, good and faithful servant. May we all hear those wonderful words. Thank you so much for your kind attention.